Okay, the first and probably the most important concept in gesture is the idea of the long axis. The long axis is also known as the action line. My teacher, Steve Huston, calls it the thrust. It's basically the defining action of the pose, the primary action of the pose. And you can find it by looking in the torso. That's the best place to start because the torso is the largest mass of the body. It drives a lot of the movement. And one concept of the long axis that's very important is that, or there's two concepts. One is that the long axis is the longest, most continual gesture in a form. So let's take a look at this model here. The longest, most continuous gesture line in a form. And remember, our marks can either be straight, C, or S curves. And generally, we're not going to use this straight. So we'll be using C's and S's are basically two opposing C's. So the longest, most continuous curved line that connects key parts of anatomy, that's the long axis, the thrust. And the two concepts that's important to remember about long axis is that one, you want to make it as long as possible and continuous as possible, because that is what a part of the goal of gesture is to describe the movement of life. And life is fluid. Human beings are basically full of water. So essentially, the long axis can theoretically continue throughout the body, and it can. You can draw that way. I'll show you what that could look like. And so that's the goal number one. And the second goal, or the second concept to understand, is that the long axis, every form has a long axis. The torso, well, the whole figure from head to toe has a long axis. The torso has a long axis, the largest mass. The leg has a long axis. The whole leg, upper, lower, the ankle, the foot, the toes, the fingers. Each little section has its own long axis because, every part is full of water. Every part has smaller parts, bigger parts made up of smaller parts. And that's the concept of gesture. I'll do a little diagram here. Part, 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 part. And gesture connects them all, right? This could be a finger, this could be the torso and the hip. So that's the idea, okay? Long axis is we want to make it as long as possible. Basically, you never want to break it. And two, every section has a long axis. Now, the goal is, or the challenge is, can you relate every section or smaller piece to the whole? Can you connect the head? Can you relate the head in one fluid line all the way to the knee down to the toe? Yes, you can. So that's the concept of the long axis, which is the true gesture in its purest form, is the long continuous line. And I always look at it as water. It's basically you're trying to draw the water. That's the way I think about it. You're trying to draw the water in a human being, symbolically as a line. But that's what we're doing. So let's take a look at this figure now. One of the things to note is that you always want to pay attention to the key landmarks, because that'll tell you where forms begin and end. Knee joints, ankles, shoulders, pit of the neck, break of the rib cage is right here. Right, so you can see it there. That's the bottom of the rib cage. Hip bone is right here. Center line of the face, eye line, elbow. So, this is a quick thing I do. So now it's basically almost like connect the dots. You don't want to think of it that way, but it's a simple way to begin. And then, there's even smaller, lesser points and parts of anatomy that can help us out. when I look at this, I think, wow, look at this little piece here. It's a less important anatomy, this quadriceps muscle, but it can help me get down to the ankle in a continuous curve. Look at the curve of the calf muscle, the gastrocnemius. It can take us this way up and around. So those are the things I look for when I begin. And of course, obviously, this one has an obvious bend in the torso. But right away, I look for the bend in the torso, because the torso can only bend one way unless it's perfectly straight up and down. So I know for a fact that is my initial statement, my initial idea for the long axis right there. Now, can I continue it throughout the body? Let's see. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a couple drawings based on this figure, and then we'll see, then I'll break them down. Okay, so first I'm going to do what I would do, what's natural to me, a more orthodox approach. Orthodox means just common. For me, anyway. So I kind of like to anchor my head. Remember that point there, key point. Now I know, okay, well, to me the torso is the most important thing. And I'm going to fill up the backside. Okay. Now I see I could have taken that down. Obviously, this is more of a shape way of doing things. Okay. So now I know I could have taken this gesture all the way down, but I kind of want that break in the leg. Exaggerate. Talk about that next. And so the next idea is the exaggeration. So really, if you're doing a 1 or 2 minute pose, this is probably as far as you can get, and that's good. That's what you want. Really, the quick poses is training for your mind. It's training for your eye and your mind. It's not really hand training. Now, it does give you great dexterity training. It's training for your mind. So that's my way of doing it. Now, I call it orthodox. It's basically according to my philosophy, which is an illustrative type of realism. I want more than gesture. Now, I'm going to show you what an animator, someone who doesn't want realism, what they would be doing. Okay, let's take a look at what that might look like. So I'm really going to go for it. I'm going to say every line is game for continuing the motion. And I'll break down this push a little bit of detail. Even now, this kind of makes me uncomfortable. I don't normally think this way because I don't want my drawings to have this my drawings don't serve an animator's purpose, really. So you see how very fluid it is. And really what I'm doing is connecting the dots, this quote dots, so-called dots, which are the points of anatomy. Okay, so I'll probably stop there if you have more time, like a 2-minute. Because remember, we're talking about life drawing here. So this, you know, your goal is just to drill your process. Your goal is not to do finished drawing. Okay, so that's another way to approach it, more of a fluid way. And let me break this down next. Okay, so what do we have here? Now, the one on the left, like I said, is more of an illustrative way to draw. This one is more of well, it's my interpretation of a more animator style drawing. So it depends on your output, your end product. Now, the concept is the same, is that the long axis is the primary movement, the connecting line between the forms. We want to make it as long as possible, and that every form has its own long axis, because larger forms are made up of smaller forms, which have also their own long axis. And generally, starting with the torso, the head to the torso, a good place to start. So in this one, you know, this one prioritizes the torso, and it prioritizes shape, because I want to eventually get to realism. That's my goal here, is to get to the 3D. This one is more about the movement. And so let's talk about that. This one probably makes more sense. So what I'm doing here is, let's take a look at this line here. So here's a nice line. We'll start with the body. I'm going across, that one's obvious. Then I go down, and I can actually bring it through the crotch and around and wrap it back up. See that? Now that's a broken line, right? It's not a comfortable way for my hand, but you know, essentially you have the beanbag there. But that is a gesture. That is a long axis that I consciously made as long as possible. Now we can come back and check this out. I can bring it up and over to the shoulder, to the tricep, back of the arm, across through the pit of the elbow, over to the side of the forearm, inner side of the forearm, down to the hand, to the finger, and then eventually I'm going to run out of real estate. So see that? That's a really nice long axis. Started with here, come up, and then I just kind of went back in and redrew it. So that's the concept of the long axis, and that's, like I said, the purest form of gesture, the long, continuous, fluid, watery line. You know, let's look at the leg, front leg is an easy example. We can even do this, take it over from the the glute, up and over the hip, top of the thigh, the knee joint, the shin, the muscle of the shin is a curve. I can either go, I could stop it here, or I could continue it. Obviously, it can still go over to the foot, and the toes eventually will lead us out. So see that? Up and over. And the back foot, same thing. That one's kind of obvious. There's a lot of ways we can go, you know. Let me try to demonstrate on the model here. See that? up and over. Then this one can connect through the elbow over. This one can go down and over. Even the arms can connect. This arm can go across, cut through the head and the neck there, come out. The arm itself, we can forego the corner of the elbow. Remember, that's what I would be after. So forego the corner, turn it into a curve, meaning ignore this landmark because it's a stop. That's a hard corner is a stop. We don't want that. Well, I want that, but you may not want that. And then bring this up and over. Boom. Eventually the fingers will stop you, or you can bring it back down. So look for excuses to continue your gesture. That's the goal here. That's the goal here. So you can even come up, cut through, go back down. This one can connect over here. And if you look at Rubens' work, Rubens does that really well. This one you can come this way instead, cut through the calf muscle. Remember, this way I went up and over the shin. That's one way. You can make it a beautiful, exaggerated curve, come across the backside. And that would look like this on the drawing. So that's the long axis. That's the first and most important concept. Let me demonstrate one more, and I'll demonstrate on the male this time. Okay, let me try to draw more of that animator's way. Because actually animators look through the inside of the form versus constructionists like me and my teacher, we look through the contour. I need that structure. That's why I put that there. Okay, so now I can bring that down. Instead of a hard corner, I'm going to try. My instinct is to make corners. I'm basically looking for ways to describe this arm. In more of a curved fashion. And if I had a timer, this was a 1 minute timer, I'd pretty much be done. I can kind of sense the time here. Okay. Now let's break this down. So obviously this is the bend in the torso. It's more of a front bend. That's the long axis. But in terms of the lifeline, if you look at the center line, it's a similar curve. So now we can kind of go, that's where I started this drawing. If you remember, I started in the middle and went down through the leg, trying to think more like an animator. So I had to get in that mode a little bit. And in terms of the arms is pretty obvious. This one is a nice curve. I'm looking at the center, the form. Take it all the way through the finger. And then I needed some structure. So I built a sort of a loosely two-dimensional, the beanbag as the animators call it, torso. And then I realized, oh, well, I can just take this down. See, to me, this is what's most exciting. Is can you, and I can see the toes pointing this way in Z space. It's covered up by the heel. So I like to use the outside, come back in through the anatomy. There's a curve in the calf, so that makes sense there. I use the anatomy as a tool, but for me, I'm more of a contour-based in my drawing philosophy. This way was more of a center line base, basically the center of the form versus the outside of the form. But the concept is the same. See how the long axis is always there. And I'm always trying to make it as long as possible. We could take this shoulder line, bring it down through the torso, out to the side, back to the calf, even kind of, well, these two forms aren't really connected, but, in drawing we could push that through. And that's, one of the things that's important about looking at guys like Rubens, because they're masters at that. And Michelangelo, of course, also, he heavily influenced Rubens. So that's the concept. See, constantly looking for ways to continue that long axis. Now, this is only the first concept. The second idea is the actual structure, which is, to me, is just as important. It's also gesture, but I thought of in sort of a different way, and that leads towards more of the illustrative side of this idea versus drawing gesture for gesture in and of itself, drawing the lifeline in and of itself. So again, depends on the end product, but if your end product is like mine, more the illustrative side, that's when we need to get into the structure and eventually adding the breaks and the corners.